we're going to talk about our Addendum exhibition at God's House Tower, and the individual works in it, in part because when we were making the show, 475 days after we had installed the other exhibition that never opened, I think we both found it quite challenging, the thought of putting down in words what exactly it was going to be, until we'd got to that day and were able to be in the space, but also kind of thinking about the wider stuff that was going on with the pandemic and working out how work sits with that. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that is right. And I think the two shows are you know, obviously interestingly contrasted, you know, in terms of time. The show which was upstairs, Those Who Look Out, Those Who Look Back, was made, you know, pre-pandemic, and in a way reflects that. There is a strange kind of optimism to it. It's humorous, it's light in parts, you know. The way that there are games which are played, you know, you can go through gigantic shorts, or you can walk across, or potentially you could have walked across kind of an ocean, you know. There are bodies floating around you, all this kind of stuff, but it was kind of comedic and light, and then pandemic strikes, and firstly the show is kind of encased in that time, and was sort of obviously locked away. Addendum becomes actually a response to that, you know, and Addendum is a show that I see as being far more melancholic and less reflective of those ideas which you know were in the previous show. The fact that it's in a, you know, we'll talk about this I'm sure, but the fact that it's in a kind of self-contained space sort of says something as well, whereas the other one has, you know, there's light and it's open, and there's a scale to it, you know, this kind of thing, and suddenly, you know, it's like it's like going into, you know, going from the conscious world into the unconscious beneath, and that's how I saw it. It's almost like because I talked about that, you know, when we were planning it and thinking about it, about the oneiric, or the idea of the dreaming object or the dreaming space. And so there is an aspect of kind of stepping down into the space of the interior space of the self, and you know, and thinking about the mind. And so I enjoy the contrast between the two shows, and I think that it accurately reflects that extremely strange timeline, you know, that they both kind of occurred within, really. So,
yeah, because I think there was something, I think, just to kind of remind ourselves that we installed the first show, Those Who Look Out, Those Who Look Back, is that right?
I think so. Yeah.
While there were cruise ships gathering on the docks outside the windows. That's and right. When over that period of, I think, 3 days or something, every time we came in, the news was changing. We both had other commitments that, you know, were very much in need because of the quickly changing time frame of things, and it was incredibly heightened. And then also that show was developed over a period, like a long time. So time in the whole process of doing these exhibitions at God's House Tower was such kind of extended and then compressed, and so I think that when like me and Dan said to us, "Oh, would you like to do another little show?" It seemed to really make sense. I was like, "Oh, I feel like I can." Yeah, definitely. I feel like this makes sense, because the idea that we'd installed this exhibition, and you know, it had particular kind of relationships. It has such a relationship with the walls of that building to me. All of that came from the kind of sculptural dialogue that we had, was all about these walls. So the idea that it would never be seen in that context was sort of heartbreaking. And then when it was going to be opened up, and then it's like, do we change it? And like, for me, particularly the video work, which was filmed on boats coming off Southampton docks, which I cut out all these people of a particular age on boats from my footage. And then all of a sudden, these kind of meta narratives of the work were like so poignant. I was like, do I just completely recut and remake that video work? So then when the idea of doing another show happened, it just felt like, oh, this is great. And it felt, I mean, I felt like it was incredibly generous and a relief to be able to have the opportunity, because we could show the show that was never shown, but also have this kind of other works in play. And I mean, I continue, because also those works were in the original show, I think it was like 2 or 3 years in the making, that show, just because of various developments of the building. And I was like, right, I'm really ready to like try something different. And so really push the kind of sculptural elements, which was really wonderful to like talk about all of that with you. I mean, I think it was great to have that opportunity to collaborate with you on it, or making the show happen. But so that's where I came to with that with the Addendum show. And I really like the idea of it being sunk beneath the sunken space, and sort of sunk beneath. However, it was so different, the actual space, this kind of grey cube with a glass window at the end.
I mean, it was like it was like sort of it was like a show in a shipping container in a way. But you know, there was that. I like this idea of sinking, and the sense that you're, you know, perhaps at the bottom of the ocean, or you've, you know, descended down, because again, subterranean kind of atmosphere or space, and as I said earlier, you know, there's an interior space of the mind, or space of isolation, or, you know, when we installed Addendum, you know, or started working towards it, you know, I worried about the kind of jarring effect of what was above and what was below. But actually, in the end, it became this, you know, and I overuse this word in my own practice, I suppose, but this idea of rupture, or something that kind of ruptured the upstairs, you know, quite a bit. It could have easily complemented it. It could have been another, you know, from me, another series of T-shirts with, you know, wild seas on them and all of that. But in the end, you know, it became these very concentrated things. And you talk about the collaboration, and I found it incredibly you know, interesting, the way, for instance, just very simple things like the you know, remade surrogate object series that I'm working on, and the idea that was kind of the piece that's placed on, which is the house Wittgenstein, which is placed on the parquet, you know, drawing floor, and things like that. And that kind of unsettling, because I'd sort of forgot or not realized quite how bleak my work was, you know, and having it placed with this kind of slippage or something else happening, a very different kind of dialogue going on between those works, really helped me now. It's helping me now, sorry, to begin to reflect on, if I'm being really overly critical, the kind of the sort of deadness or muteness of those things, and the fact that they need perhaps something else. So I think for me, from both shows, there was a real, you know, there was an energizing to the work, to my work in relationship to yours, and how that operated. And I think that couldn't have happened, you know, without, if they've been solo shows or whatever it might be. So I think the collaboration, again, talking about that, has been so important to my practice, you know. at the moment I'm not making new work, but that is, is something that I'm going to obviously change shortly. But I think those ideas are coming in, they're coming into the work, definitely. Yeah. So
can you give us a summary of your works then that are in the show?
Well, the works in the show are these are what I call remade surrogate objects. So they're basically plaster casts of kind of throwaway things, which were at the time were found around the studio that I had in Southampton. I'm based in Salford now, but so they were kind of throwaway items, and offcuts of wood and all this sort of stuff, kind of scruffy little things. And I don't know why I said that, scruffy little things, but anyway. But what I've always been interested in is this idea of kind of big ideas, contained within small, innocent things. And it's what they call kind of pareidolia or anthropomorphic or not anthropomorphic, what am I thinking? Anyway, but pareidolia, where you look at something and you go, oh, there's a face, or, there's Jesus in the clouds, or whatever it might be. And so the pieces that are there is what looks like a round cut piece of wood, but it's actually plaster that's then painted up to look like a round cut piece of wood. And the title for that relates to Mary Shelley, when she was writing Frankenstein in Geneva. Mount Tambora in Indonesia had which was a volcano, it's dormant now, but that kind of exploded, and rather like the pandemic, sort of spewed out all this ash. So it meant that across the world, there was the need to stay indoors and to not go out and breathe, the air. And so that, without realizing it, I suppose I began to reflect on the current situation, with that. And when you look at the piece, you see these kind of specks of paint, and that's the idea of lava and all this kind of thing. So you read the title and then you look at the object and you start to kind of imagine, start to think about Mary Shelley and start to think about the evolution of Frankenstein kind of emerging out of this event, working with that. So there's another piece, which is a small kind of stone. A lot of those were kind of picked up on beaches around Hampshire. So I'd go for walks and with my family at the time, and we would, I'd just collect stuff and chuck it in my pocket and things like that. And that was one of those, kind of items. And anyway, it's a small stone, but that's called Execution of Louis XIV. So it's again a kind of, I suppose, a bit of a kind of joke in a way, that obviously the stone is his head, there's that sort of aspect to it. So there's a kind of playful aspect with that. The other pieces that are there, the piece that I mentioned, which is on the parquet floor, is called Haus Wittgenstein. And basically, Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, this was his sister's house. And Wittgenstein was working at an independent school, and apparently had done some horrendous thing to a child there, which I think hit a child or something like that, and was fairly kind of shamed and kicked out of the school. And his sister, to take his mind off it, said, look, I'm building this house, perhaps you could come along and put some ideas into it. The piece is basically a plaster cast of chipboard with a gaffer tape, kind of sliver on it. With that, which is kind of looks like a window, and then the cut of the board looks like a house and all this kind of stuff. So there's all these kind of, stories behind, I suppose, these objects. Like I said, they're not just about seeing an image. It's about this idea of something much, much larger in that. The final piece is a piece of driftwood, again, from these sort of beach walks that I used to do. And it's called Waratah 1909. Now, Waratah was a container ship that disappeared in 1909 between Durban and Cape Town in kind of mysterious circumstances. So kind of, Marie Celeste type, sort of thing. As it is, it's this cast piece of plaster that's painted up to a cast, bit of driftwood, sorry, that's painted up to look like driftwood. and it sits very low on the wall in the show, which was kind of your idea, actually, I have to say. So, and that works really well because it's kind of hovering, you know, above. And I think there's one of your salt castle, you know, pieces underneath it. And again, it's almost like also this thing about I suppose in a way they're kind of objects you could miss as well. You know, you could step on or step over, and they're extremely fragile. You know, they're only made of plaster, and if you turn them over, there's a scruffy sort of backside to them. You know, with all of this, but they were, you know, in their disappearance, if you like, within a space, or their kind of the idea of them being kind of like looking like non-art. I mean, they're quite ugly things, really. They're, you know, they're not really beautiful in any shape or form, and they look like excuses for a painting or excuses for a sculpture and all this sort of stuff. But in that kind of potential forgetting, of course, they carry this weight. You know, they carry this weight of narrative, you know, with them, and sort of hidden history or something, you know, in there. So yeah. So the pieces themselves are, you know, are, as I said, this idea of a kind of fantastical idea, but contained in something ordinary and mundane and everyday. But what about your pieces?
Well, I think that mine. I mean, what I really enjoyed about yours was the sort of the narrative of art being a relic or like a relic, yes, and the thinking and the dwelling that it prompted. They prompt as a body of work, that kind of looking and going, is that it? Or there must be something more. Oh, hang on a minute, you know, and looking and looking. And I think that I mean, yes, it was a real challenge thinking of this grey project space. Like, we were all like, you know, grey's like really hot in interior design. And we're so used to like grey as a default, but actually it was an incredibly challenging space to put works into. And actually, I'm really glad we did that treatment on the glass, which seemed to sort of like play upon some of this sort of imagining of it being a sunken space, but seemed to just sort of interrupt that constructed environment. But with my works, I mean, I really went to and fro to use a kind of characteristic in what to put in. And I think that it really was because, I mean, I have a socially engaged practice and then have this kind of interest in making fabrics, perpetuating social narratives of fabrics, and video making, kind of connecting with ideas of performance and how an audience interact with work, and kind of choreography I often think about. So I think during the pandemic, I had this, being interested in socially engaged practice, this real thing about how that has like fundamentally changed. And it's going to be changed for quite a while, however much we think it's all going back to normal in terms of the values of gathering. And essentially, you know, my work, I'm interested in what makes people gather and the kind of commonalities between us. The works upstairs were thinking, which is where the show was thinking about the sea as this kind of common space or environment between us, and playing upon that and playing upon a sort of feminine narrative of it, looking at kind of diversifying the sort of histories of the sea, and kind of romantic notions about it. So I'd started to change what I was doing in some ways. There was a change in my practice, but I never got to show the work to kind of understand what was going on. And then there was this whole thing of like socially engaged practice and event kind of based way of working kind of disappearing, and then the sort of values of gathering changing. So I was thinking about this kind of common, what is common between us, and kind of common substances. Well, that's how salt I basically ended up getting to salt, and salt is having this common substance, and actually having so many different narratives and stories about it, which is what I'm always interested in when it comes to groups of people. I'm interested in maybe what a group, the story of a group may be, but then the contrasts with individuals' position or narratives within that. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I'd started to think about salt, and about salt as also being something that is ingested by our bodies. So it's not just something that we see or touch, it's something that's kind of is within us, we can get within us. It's something that we're made of. It's something that we can have a tiny bit of and it tastes amazing, and we can have lots of, and it has this element of disgust. And then also the different social stories and practices around salt, histories of salt. I mean, I'm trying to think of like one or two examples because I've just started to try and map out different narratives about it. But there's lots of kind of, I can't think of any, traditions of salt, which I can't think of. Did I tell you any of them? Oh my gosh, I can't think of any of them. Things where salt can be a blessing, or, you know, the sort of traditions of like a salt circle to be a kind of protection, or, you know, sayings about worth their salt and things like that. So it seems like it's a really kind of potent substance. And to think of this as this commonality between us. I mean, to think about that commonality, it was the development of thinking about community centres and everybody sitting on like those blue kind of plastic chairs. I realise it's getting darker and darker when I'm leaning in. So yeah, I had been thinking about salt, and then I had some conversations with people, or some sort of daydreams about having these kind of piles of salt and these mounds of salt. I think that there was an element of wanting to think about the lament. I had the other works in the space are they are a soundtrack of shanty sea salties. I've lost my words today, but sea shanties by a local shanty band who were originally going to sing in the space, and then a year and a bit later, they have managed to do it. And that was again thinking about the walls of the space, and thinking about, it became a mainly broadcast performance piece. Because of the different, it was all within the rules, but there were still rules in place. And I'm interested in that near and far, and that buy-in into community and collective, and how that's changing with the how near and far we are from people at different times. And I was interested in the toing and froing, the sort of sculptural elements of the sea, and bringing that into the sea shanties. I mean, essentially they've sung sea shanties, but it's like, what happens if you put that in the context of the exhibition and in a contemporary art context, and thinking about singing as a social form. And then I've also got a very large carpet, which I surprised you with on the day of install, which is of herringbone parquet-like flooring, and it's a hand-drawn pattern, which has then been sized up. I can't remember, a little bit. I think is it like 4 to 1? It's like 25% of it is like ×4 in its size up. So it's hand-drawn parquet flooring and herringbone, and that's actually originated as part of an exhibition a few years ago, where again I was thinking about common spaces and common patterns. So I'm interested in fabric, and I'm interested in pattern, and I'm interested as pattern as a sort of reiteration, and the connection between visual patterns and kind of patterns of behaviour and things like that. So herringbone is traditionally the most stable flooring. It was like used for Roman roads, and it seems like a good thing. It seems like we all need some stable ground to walk upon. And when we were talking about that space, and I'd been to visit it, just all of a sudden I was like, actually, this kind of toing and froing and kind of rocking of the waters, and the fact you can see the waters outside the windows upstairs, it felt like this would give a really kind of great rooting for the work and kind of base to place things upon. So the works are all very personal and very instinctive, and I think you know, thinking about God's House Tower being an artist-run space, actually, it was great to have that space to work in and that kind of freedom, and to really kind of use that as an opportunity to work in a way that I maybe don't normally work when it's kind of more curated or kind of commissioned, but their open-mindedness to things kind of evolving, and it really seemed to be a chance to do that. So it's kind of it's a body of work which I'm still kind of processing. I mean, in terms of the salt, I'm interested in starting to think about kind of citizenship science and approaches to collectively looking at kind of certain kind of elements of sociology, and thinking about how I can orchestrate collective investigation into salt as a common form between us. But it was great to have that. Yeah, it just felt really meaningful to have that there. And to me, I found myself referring back to an old show where I realized then there was an element of kind of monuments or kind of anti-monuments and laments, and I think that kind of quietness, and definitely I think in both shows was this kind of choreography of an audience of how walking into that space may slow you down, make you wonder what you're looking at, why you're looking at it. Is the salt going to fall over? Is it a sandcastle? Played around a lot with how obvious it could be a sandcastle or not. And I think that's the kind of one of the commonalities between it. So I don't know, that's not sort of as well refined sure thinking about your works, but it's kind of works in progress. It's kind of what I was working on or thinking about during the pandemic. So to have that opportunity was great.
Just the thing that I was thinking was, you know, you brought so many elements into these two shows. You know, in a sense, you know, without oversimplifying it, you know, it wasn't simply static. You know, there was the video. There's the video upstairs, and then obviously the sea shanties. You know, for the second show, there were other things which kind of come into this, which again are about that sense of displacement or uncertainty. You know, in the Addendum show downstairs, and the first thing I would say is that there's a kind of precarity to the works downstairs. You know, the salt, like you say, is going to collapse. The herringbone floor is hand drawn, so it's kind of it's not fixed. You know, there's a kind of it's shimmering, if you like. I don't know. And but I was also going to, and then there's my objects, which are kind of throwaway and, you know, junk that are cast up. But interestingly, the whitewashed windows, and it just occurred to me this, and the herringbone rolled out floor is very much like a sort of office, you know, locked up during lockdown, or a shop or a store locked up during lockdown. That idea of the whitewashed windows and the herringbone. And I suppose I'm saying that because, in a way, looking at Addendum, it's like a sort of you know, drunken dream or something. You know, there's that kind of thing. Everything's kind of.
I'm going to put a light on because I've got so dark in a second.
Okay, you're turning into Nosferatu with that. You should go with what I'm going on, which is the interrogation room look. You know, that's the thing. I'm ready to confess. You know.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of that displacement, that sort of displacement. I mean, I don't want to overuse that thing of, you know, dreaming and all the rest of it, because it's also this, you know, when you are, you know, when you're intoxicated, you know, either by something good or bad, everything becomes fractured, you know, and opens up. And that's what downstairs is to me, is that kind of, you know, all these lots of different elements coming in at the same time. I mean, what I like about the show downstairs, unlike the one upstairs, which is that, in a sense, on paper, it probably shouldn't work. You know, if you interviewed us separately and said, well, I'm going to do salt sandcastles and this, and then I'm going to do these remade surrogate objects, it's like, how on earth is that gonna fit? Whereas upstairs there was a kind of, you mentioned about choreography, I think in the work, and upstairs is highly choreographed in a way. Thinking about it now, you know, it's very it's quite slick in lots of ways. Downstairs is kind of a bit messy, you know.
Yeah.
And I like that. I like that because I think there's a sort of I don't know. You know, I didn't want to. I think we've touched on a little bit about the audience and the way that, you know, the audience navigates the space. And I always felt it should be difficult. You know, I always felt that there should be elements in there which make it difficult to get around. You know, both upstairs and downstairs. Like if you remember going all the way back, you know, to our first conversations, in Southampton, I talked about, you know, the idea of a dripping towel or a dripping shirt or whatever it was, you know, stuff like this. So the idea of wetness being around was, and we did talk about that. And we were good. And also, if you remember, we were going to dig the floor up and put and make a pool. That was the plan.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
at one point, yeah, we should definitely do that, but maybe not there. But there's that. But so I think that idea of wrong footing, for want of a better words, the audience coming into the space was something which I think downstairs does, you know, in lots of ways. It's not, you know, it's not easy to navigate, and I think that's really useful, I think.
But it's also I think it's experiential. The whole thing is a live event, and I think that we both kind of met in this place of like, yeah, we can push ourselves with doing this 2-person show and try, you know, and I think our practices are quite different, but I think we both kind of challenged each other with bringing like ideas of our practice together and kind of pushed ourselves to be ambitious. And I think that one of the things that, you know, you really hope that people go and see your show in the real, and then even more so after the pandemic in some ways, but also like when you go in there, there's textures, there's sound, there's slowing down of how you move around the space. There's you know, as you the thing with the addendum is that you actually encounter that first before you see the original show. The windows were a really big part of when we were talking about the curating of the upstairs show, and like what people might see out of them, and when there's daylight in the space. And I think there was just something where the space upstairs became another work in the exhibition. So like downstairs, the whitewash or grey wash on the glass is kind of a collaborative work, and actually upstairs the space became our kind of collaboration and how we were arranging it. And I think that was a really interesting process to go through. But then also, like, that was such a long period of time thinking about that show, and then downstairs was it wasn't quick, but in some ways it was quick, because in the lead up to it we didn't know what the world would be like if one person could come into the space, or if they could only view it through glass, or really what was going to happen. So I think there's this kind of stretching of time and the like economy of attention, you know, in terms of elements of repetition and courting of attention in different ways.
And I think that's hugely contrasted, you know, between the two. I think the again going back to the collaboration is that, you know, again on paper, you know, a lot of things shouldn't have worked. You know, our practices are so different, but you know, it did, and there was a kind of synergy, you know, between everything, which was really unexpected. And I felt that even though we'd not really done a lot of talking, you know, in the build up to Addendum, we'd had meetings, you know, about it, obviously, and had dialogue about that. But if you remember, you know, that the way we curated that space happened really quickly. It was really fast, you know, with that.
Yeah.
And I felt that that was because there was a real sense of both of us kind of inhabiting the works as a whole, or inhabiting the idea as a whole, in a way that all right, you have that in collaboration anyway, and of course you should, but it was something that was really really evident to me, that it's that thing of kind of almost like mind reading, you know, like da, 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 and making it come together with that. But I think in the end, you know, every you know, the dialogue that's going on, or the relationship between the works is something which isn't superficial, or it's not just kind of added in. There's definitely a sense of what's the word I'm going to use, which I don't want to use, wholeness. There's a kind of wholeness to it, which was very unexpected in those first initial meetings, you know, 400 years ago, or whenever we were meeting up about it. With that, there was a real sense of quite how on earth this was going to work, and it certainly there is a very kind of clear dialogue, and you know, and just the way that we tuned into that sort of, you know, again, you know, the upstairs space and then the contained space, and that don't forget, that could have been a show of souvenirs, you know, of upstairs. And it certainly isn't. I think you go to both shows, and I think you get very, very different experiences, you know, which is what makes it so worthwhile, really, you know.
Yes, check it out, everyone.
Yeah, exactly. Check it out after it's closed.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. Check Instagram.
Yeah.
It's all over there. That's where
I think what was really nice, listening to you and thinking about how things communicate. And I think the show maybe came along at a point where I was ready for things to shift up a gear, or to change a bit anyway. Is that we allowed the work to talk to each other. Like I like talking about work. I can talk about work all the time, but I'm not maybe so good at talking about my own work. But actually, I think that great work always has something that you can't verbalize. Yeah. And I think actually what was quite nice, you know, like the works touch, that's kind of quite radical in some ways, you know, like to kind of put works together in that way when you've not made them to operate in that way. And I think allowing the works to talk to each other and have something else going on is really like making work in itself. Like, you know, we weren't making shirt, felt like we were making work together, I suppose. So yeah, I suppose we were lucky to have been together in that way.
I think there's that thing of, you know, when you see, you know, and I do think I know that I'm in this show, or these shows, but I do think it's a very good show. And if you've not seen it, everybody, well, you know, you've missed a treat. But there is that, you know, sometimes you have that problem where you see group shows and it's kind of everything has its unique space, or it's kind of a unique zone. And what's interesting about this, which is not unique, of course, which is the way that you have that crossover and the idea, like you say, of kind of touching and you know, the interaction between works is so important. And I would say that this was something that you know, presented and kind of encouraged, you know, throughout both exhibitions.
Oh, sorry, I didn't really.
Well, I think I think that's a strength of it, and to me, it makes perfect sense, because otherwise, for instance, the heads, you know, which are actually, you know, these bosun head lifeboatmen, and are probably, you know, as kind of humorous as they are, they're probably the bleakest thing upstairs. Maybe I don't know, but you know, it enabled them to have a sort of a kind of life where they were seeping into the other works, you know, your works, things like that, and I thought that was really good. And you know, and here we go, you know, that's probably an aspect of curation that I may not have originally thought could have I would have done. Sorry, I would have actioned elsewhere. But I think working with you, there was that encouragement always, which I hope was the same from me to you. Not to sound like the Chuckle Brothers, but that kind of that sort of interplay and merging, which I think was right from the start, really. You know. Yeah.
No, there definitely was. I mean, in a really kind of simplified term, the thing that I really took from it was these kind of the sculptural kind of thinking about work as sculpture, which I never really think about, or I sort of skirt around.
Yeah.
So I felt like it was allowing me to put my work in that context that you were creating of a sculpture show, which is always really interesting to see in different ways. So
yeah, there was something I wanted to add, actually, which is a recent experience that I've had, which is that, you know, I'm starting to learn to sail, and the reason I'm doing that is because my family were all sailors, and I let the side down. My grandfather was born on a boat as it arrived in New York Harbor, you know, in a harbor in New York. And my father was a trawlerman, and also, you know, raced catamarans and all this kind of stuff, you know. Yeah. Anyway, I'm about to do that. But what I did do recently was I took a motorboat out onto Lake Windermere. And the one thing that I found, which I was totally unaware of, and have, felt like a major discovery, really, was that out on the water, it doesn't matter whether it's an inland lake or the sea or whatever it might be, but time slows down. Yeah. And that is something that hadn't really occurred to me. And then looking back at the show, and again, I'm going to talk about that sort of, I called it drunken dream or something like that, but I'm going to use the word woozy kind of feel to the other space. There's an aspect of that. There's an aspect of time slowing. And I was pleased that, having experienced it, having the incredible opportunity to, as I said, sail a motorboat on Lake Windermere. I never thought I'd get that opportunity, but anyway, I did. That's actually what occurs, you know. So if there's any sailors out there, you know, listening or watching this, take note, because I think that, you know, the next time, you know, and 10 minutes feels like an hour, you know, it's that kind of, that sort of thing. It's quite incredible, really.
I think that's so I was reading about swimming earlier, so a lot of the first show was thought about while swimming. So I swim as one of my think spaces. And I was reading about, I can't remember what that one is called, someone earlier, a photographer in the magazine called Upstate Diary. I highly recommend it. And he was talking about wild swimming, and how wild swimming is this really kind of fully embodied but pure space to exist in. And I think that body of water, that idea of a body of water, and then, you know, salt has a relationship to bodies of water, and the visceral nature of it. And I think those visceral registers are apparent in both shows, and this is where it starts to connect with kind of histories of sculpture. And do you identify as the sculptor maker? Sculptor. And I think that's the kind of the key to the whole shows, is to kind of be immersed within and surrounded by these sculptural elements.
The object plays a key, you know, role, but they're also like archipelago, you know, they're kind of they're islands, you know, within the space, and also upstairs as well.
But that's that wooziness, that's that dreamlike, that's that those states of mind, they have different possibilities and they have different readings. So I think it's always interesting. I mean, when you put a show on and people walk into it and they see something completely different, some people get extremely offended by it, but I think it's so interesting how we can all be looking at the same thing and thinking different things about it. And I think that's where you've got that kind of woozy underwater kind of shifting of time and scale is another thing that kind of, you know, really sort of plays around in both shows, that opens up those possibilities. And I think that's also what was nice about not having to write text about the addendum. It was like to have that openness. Super exciting.
I think that's an important point, because upstairs, you know, we have an explanation, I suppose. You know, there's in other words, there's an encouragement of a reading. So upstairs, you're awake. You know, you're kind of there's a clarity to it.
Yeah,
it's like daylight. And then downstairs, you know, there's the all of that, you know, disappears, and suddenly you're just left to find your way through, you know.
Whatever that show you see first.
Yeah, I know that's true, actually. I mean, I'm thinking of it in the reverse because of the timeline, I suppose. But you go into the underbelly first, and then you know, emerge into the light. And I think there's a kind, you know, I mentioned at the start about, you know, there being a kind of melancholic aspect to it. And I don't mean this in a, you know, in any sort of silly way, but there's a depressing element to perhaps the show downstairs, just because of the, you know, the darkness, the grey, the fact that that things are kind of clearly fragmented, you know, with that. I mean, I'm not, you know, trying to talk about my own state of mind, but there is that aspect, you know, to it that I think is really intriguing, because there's so much, because upstairs there's so much kind of optimism, and there's so much openness with that. And coming out of the pandemic as we are is actually, you know, on one level, you know, well, we're not really out of the pandemic, let's be honest, but
no, we're learning to live in it.
Yeah, we're learning to live. That's it. Is that actually things are skewed? Things are, you know, things have been altered. We're in an altered state. You know, time is out of joint.
Yeah.
And it still is, you know, with that. And so I think maybe, the audience experience kind of going into that sort of subterranean space first is quite an interesting one, because it should be reflective of their experience, you know. Now that was obviously the idea of it, but I think it plays, it's like a kind of minor chord to then upstairs, which is a sort of major, you know, chord in a way, with that. So I think that contrast is really is one of the kind of what I wanted to say was, I think it's really smart. It's an interesting kind of play off, because as I said again earlier, is that could have been a show of kind of souvenirs from upstairs. And I'm so glad that we didn't go down that route, or you know, or you know, put more T-shirts in or whatever it was, you know, with that, or any more towels, you know, that it really is this dialogue of an unconscious and then a conscious space or something, you know, with that.
It's like Back to the Future, isn't it?
Back to the, probably, actually. Yeah, if you look closely at one of my pieces, you can see the face of Michael J. Fox coming through.
That thing where they call it Back to the Future, but they were never going forward in time until a bit further on into the Back to the Futures, when they were going back in time. You just always be flummoxed by, why is it called Back to the Future when you're going back in time? So it's just when you think about these interesting times.
Who can we ask about that? Yeah.
I don't know.
No.
Maybe we should leave it on that.
We should.